Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Grain Feed, brought to you by EverAg. This is your weekly news feed for all things grain and all things feed. Each week we bring you updates on the markets with unique perspectives from an amazing team of analysts with the intention of helping dairy and livestock producers manage their risk. I'm your host, Jim Matthews, reporting from the Chicago office on a lovely Wednesday afternoon. Joining me today from Champaign, Illinois, in a return to the Grain Feed, professor, author, economist, and Lawrence J. Norton Chair of Agricultural Marketing at the University of Illinois, Dr. Scott Irwin. Scott, how are we today?
Doing very well.
Excellent. Very nice. I hope you are a bit warmer downstate than it is up here in Chicago. It's lovely. It's 40s, but you're asking for a bit more here mid-April.
No, it's lovely in the mid-50s and quite sunny, so it's a nice day.
That sounds beautiful. Maybe good planting weather. We'll see. We'll see how things look as we get through the weekend. 'Cause it's been a little bit wetter here lately, but I think we'll be chatting about that and maybe a few other things. But before we do, Paige, if you would kindly timestamp the broadcast, it's Wednesday afternoon. A quick look at how the markets settled today. We had May corn up 3 cents at $4.84 1/4 in Chicago, and Deese up 2.5 at $4.66 in the orders. May beans nearby up 2 3/4 at $10.38 3/4, and Nove beans up 4.5 cents at $10.34 1/4, and then that soybean meal, maybe not as stubborn little byproduct as of late, but we were up $2.50 per ton today on May, nearby at $296.70, with December up $2.60 at $310.20 per ton here at the board today. So the screens were just slightly green today in Chicago on a very light trade, higher, at least on the grains and oilseed side. And Scott, we've had a lot impacting that grain market that has been, I suppose, just slightly elevated as of late, or at least it's been a pretty decent bounce in corn since the liquidation we saw through, let's say, end of February into the first half of March. And there's been plenty that's happened since then, maybe adding to some of this recovery, but some of that includes, of course, some trade wars and some tough tariff talks and how that impacts our commodity markets. We had a big planting report at the end of March. And then, of course, we had a WASDE report last week with a maybe slight tightening of the old crop balance sheet. And then, of course, we have a lot to review, as always, in that renewables market as it impacts the demand of our balance sheet. And that impacts the price of feed, of course, for those feeding our animals here in the United States. So, Scott, in terms of the big macro trade picture, what have you been thinking of the events of late and how they're impacting some of our commodity markets?
Well, it's been truly historic. That's something I have to keep in mind, is that this is really unprecedented, kind of dramatic, in a very short period of time, change in U.S. trade policy we really haven't seen for 100 years. So, we're all struggling for what it's going to mean. I think there are 3 things that I'm thinking about mostly with regard to the trades and tariff issues right now. Number one, which dog is going to win the fight within the Trump administration over whether permanent high tariff walls are a good thing and that's the ultimate objective? That would in general be really bad for U.S. agriculture. Or is the other dog going to win, which is more transactional, that the tariffs are just a version of Trump's 4D chess to get our tariffs from our competitors down to what he would regard as a fairer level. I think the story is initially the first dog won, and we went hard with the initial announcement, kind of threw the global economy against the windshield, especially the T-bond market. And so Trump had his 90-day blink, and now we're kind of just sorting through the rubble, if you will.
Yeah, I would say that's a great outlook on this thing, right? Of which dog is going to win that protectionist versus transactional. I think what's been super interesting about, the corn market in particular was that the protectionist idea was kind of honed in within North America, maybe as we kicked off the Trump second term back in January and through some of that rally we saw and then ultimate liquidation as well through February because it was a will or won't we have a friendly trade dynamic with Mexico impacting that corn market? And then, yes, to start off April, now it's been a will we or won't we trade with the globe? So, as you suggested, perhaps maybe the transactional side of this could gain the upper hand and at least be a part of just a broader, maybe negotiating tactic, or so some of us may at least hope, because of course we'd like to have normalized relations and a bit more consistent pricing, I suppose, in terms of our grain and oilseed markets here. Scott, that being said, I mean, a lot of the talk of the recent weeks and months has been this bigger picture, broader, macro side of things. And then, sprinkled in here was a pretty massive planting report at the end of March. And despite seeing 95 million plus projected acres of corn in the US, for the most part, corn pricing has actually hung in there for a little bit. So I guess any take on, first of all, the acreage numbers themselves, and then secondly, what you think of the very early stages of what is the now U.S. planting season here in the Midwest?
Sure. That was a little heavier on corn acres than I expected. I was about 94, like most of the market. So, it's a big corn number. We'll see if we get it all planted. It is interesting to see that the corn market has survived as well as it has. A big looming question over all the grain and livestock markets is tariff turmoil already baked a recession into the cake for sometime in 2025, early 2026. So we really need to watch the macro data to see. There was an encouraging retail sales report yesterday, but maybe that's because people were buying in advance of the tariff, so we just have to watch that data, I think, more closely than we usually do. I also think the corn market has been benefiting kind of quietly from the weather developments with the second crop in Brazil. The heavy safrinha corn regions in center west Brazil have gotten really dry. That dryness that kind of started in the south in the latter part of the soybean growing season, which has nicked their soybean yields, has now seemed to move up the country and is possibly doing some damage to their corn yields. And I think that's probably part of what's going on there. And then probably also feeding into concerns about U.S. planting progress. This has been far from a great planting season so far, although I was pleased. I drove back from Chicago yesterday and I actually saw a few planters in the field yesterday. But, now we're past the 15th of April when we'd like to have a lot of the central Illinois corn and soybean crops planted already, and we've barely even, turned many wheels. So there's definitely growing concern, but that's got to be tempered at this point. The real issue with planting, everybody looks at, are we getting it in early? Are we getting it in early? But the key, at least from the data, is avoiding getting it in really late. That's where the real damage occurs. And we're still about a month away from where that would cause real problems. But on the other hand, the weather forecasts, once we get to this weekend, are not very encouraging. It's good to address the drought conditions out west, but gosh, we'd like to get the crop in first and then let's have it rain, not before we get it planted. And so I think all of that's just creating some uncertainty on the supply side.
Yeah, it is certainly not perfect. I think there's been a lot of comparisons to last year as well, where we started off, dry, got into mid-April, and folks were a little bit concerned with where we stood from a planning perspective. I think it's interesting. The rain is welcome. It might rain out some of our Easter egg hunts here on Sunday a bit. But yes, the flip side of that is it then pushes folks back, potentially yet another week who have not gotten the start that they were hoping to get by the second half of April kicking off, which shockingly we are now in, which is it's difficult to believe. But, as I think it's also interesting, Scott, of the, 95 million acres of corn is not a bullish number by any means, but we are in this I don't want to say vulnerable window, but we are waiting to really get planting going here. We are still waiting for a strong harvest in South America. And like you said, I think the South American weather kind of flew under the radar there for a bit because South American weather was pretty rough, but then largely recovered. Conditions are great. And I think we all just kind of turned our focus back to North America, and somewhere on the back burner there cooking is the Brazilian safrinha crop a little bit. So we kind of do have to really keep our eyes on that one. I guess
And it's such a short window too.
yes.
It's the next 2 or 3 weeks, it better rain in Mato Grosso.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
Yes, it's a pretty crucial time period here. And it's one of those things, too. And we see this in summer rallies here in the United States in June and July. If and when it does rain well, that drought premium kind of just pops and we see this thing turn lower. So we'll see. That has to happen first. And then to kind of flip back to the demand side, Scott, I mean, we talked about the export trade and the macro side of things, but, there's also you mentioned some of the economic concerns of the overall well-being of the U.S. and global economy. And then really kind of diving into, how this all impacts the renewable markets, on the ethanol side for corn, biodiesel, renewable diesel, on the soybean side of things. What are you seeing on that front?
It's a real mixed bag, honestly, because on one hand, a lot of early concerns that Canada might put a punitive tariff on U.S. ethanol exports to Canada. And Canada is by far and away our largest buyer of U.S. corn in the form of ethanol, the way I like to put it. And because that's what it is, U.S. ethanol exports are now pushing 2 billion gallons a year. And that's around 750 million bushels of corn. So that's a big chunk of our demand base now. So it's sensitive to trade conditions. On the other hand, we have successfully solved the Chinese UCO problem with our current standoff with China on trade. We could see this coming before the end of the year, that those imports, which are a real sore point with U.S. corn and soybean farmers involved in some of the legislation moving through Congress now. But for the time being, all of that massive wave of UCO that was coming into the U.S. from China, it can still come in from other places. That's just a dead stop. And that's definitely a positive for vegetable oil and in particular soybean oil demand. We've also gotten some leaks of the numbers for the biomass-based diesel mandate that have come out of DC, and those are very bullish numbers to the degree that they're verified for the veg oil sector.
Yeah. And I think, Scott, to talk about that used cooking oil that does come into this country at a pretty nice clip. I mean, if we do indeed slow that down fairly dramatically, I think we're going to continue to see some big swings in the bean oil market. And we've been seeing those swings. I think that market's trying to figure itself out right now. I think to, soybean meal's credit, it's mostly stayed in a range lately, trying to figure out what its crushed counterpart is going to end up doing here. And we also have to watch the U.S. crush pace closely as well, because we might have had a slight drawback to start this year compared to the record pace that we've been maintaining, but it's still a very strong crush pace. So I think, some of these kind of under the radar trade ramifications, for better or for worse. I think you brought up there's a sneaky amount of ethanol that gets exported from this country, to our neighbors to the north, whereas that, regular old corn to our neighbors to the south. I mean, this is kind of a huge deal in terms of how we're going to trade within North America and or around the world. So it's going to be a really interesting stretch. Scott, before I sign off here, anything else you want us to cover?
Well, I think that it's going to be a really interesting growing season, I believe. And I think, it's now kind of moved into the background for the time being, but we have had this severe drought conditions in the Southwest and up through the Great Plains and into the Western Corn Belt. And that's something I'm really keeping my eye on. These rains this weekend are going to help, but I think we really want to keep our eye on that is this going to be a temporary relief on the moisture front, or is this just a real turning point and we're going to have a great growing season? We're kind of on, I think, a pivot point on that right now.
Yeah. And I think, as we talk about this on April 16th, it's not an immediate concern. But if we're having the exact same conversation on May 16th, then Scott, like, we probably have a problem, or we have had one. Of course, a perfect summer could potentially do some offsetting of a difficult start to this thing. But yeah, the longer we go with these issues, the more ultimately it will, I guess, limit this trend line yield projection that the USDA is, at least at the moment, still providing in terms of our production estimates. It's very early, but we have to certainly have to keep an eye on things as we push forward. So, Scott, that being said, thank you so much for returning to the show today. It is great to have you on here. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I really enjoy it.
Excellent. Very good. And also like to wish everybody a very happy Easter weekend. It's a little bit later of an Easter, we know, but very important, and looking forward to spending time with some good quality folks as we move into this weekend. And of course, birthday shout out to my lovely wife. Happy birthday to Miss Natalie Matthews. And also, again, happy Good Friday and Easter to the rest of the crew. We'd also like to thank the Everag Insights crew for their support. Thank you to Paid for Production Magic, and thank you, the viewers, for watching the Grain Feed. Contact information is on the screen. We greatly appreciate your feedback. That's all for today. We'll see you next time on the Grain Feed.